Imagine leaving everything, everything you know, everything you are. That's where this story begins. A big dream that dared to cross borders, to face down fear. Their son grew up in the aftershock of that bravery, navigating a world that often saw him as other. He walked through their days, carried their name, but the echoes of another life resonated within. And within that struggle, a heart beat strong, a heart that learned to define itself on its own terms. This is about that heart. This is the story of Hugh Kingston. Today I have a very special guest. Remember, the content of my podcast and what I want to work on is exposing you to stories stories you may not be able to hear, human experiences you may have never heard of, and of things dealing with migration and people with unusual skills. Maybe all of those combined. Today I have a very special guest. He was a former colleague of mine. I brought him in because he and I share a very interesting background, and it's for me a topic that I love talking about because it's something that I sort of experienced in a different way. But we're going to discuss this today. Today, my guest is a gentleman called Hugh Kingston. Welcome today, Mr. Hugh. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great to join you here.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining. I know this is your first podcast, so we're just going to have a very kind of flowy conversation, just like our office, not in Spanish, obviously, like we always joke around, but it's just going to be a good conversation between two good friends. And I want people to, understand different experiences, just like your background, right? And I know you're not the only person like this, and you don't represent everyone in your situation, but I think it's a very cool perspective to learn about and to understand. And given also the nature of where you are now and where your life is now, I think there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of input you could bring and positivity to this audience. So really, really, thank you for taking the time to be here with me today.
No problem. Thank you for having me again.
All right. So, as discussed earlier, one of the main reasons I brought you here is because you have a very interesting background. It's not when people think about human relations and like immigration and things like that, they almost always associate a specific type of personality with a specific type of background culturally and geographically, right? And your story is a little different from that, and I want to pick your brain about it, and I would love for you to share what that background is for you, right? So, can you give me a little bit of your background, like where you're from, like where you were born, like sort of your upbringing, where your parents are from, brothers, sisters, stuff like that, just to start.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, my name is Hugh Kingston right now at the moment, but my birth name was actually quite different. My birth name was actually Hugo Chu, and that in and of itself is a little bit different, I guess you could say. In regards to my background, I guess I should just hit up on my the ethnicity question. My parents are both Chinese. They both came from somewhat mainland China, Guangzhou area, southern China, I guess you could say, close to Hong Kong. However, back in the 70s, they had migrated over to Colombia, South America. I guess my dad, back then it was very, very common for, I guess, Chinese fathers or Chinese, the older Chinese males to go outside of the country to try to make some money and then bring money back home. And I guess this is all pre-internet era, pre-Google, all of Facebook, all that stuff. And I guess my dad had friends that were working in Latin America and had urged them, hey, this is a great place for you to make some money and then send it back home. And then, and yeah, and I guess he had a friend who was in Colombia, and I guess encouraged him into partnering together to open up a Chinese restaurant in Cali, Colombia, which is the second largest city in Colombia, next to Bogota. But yeah, I guess he did that. He was still connecting with my mother in Hong Kong and everything. And I guess once he got established, he urged my mom to go down to Colombia, and that's where they got married. And then they had me and my brother there. And yeah, for most of my, I guess for my initial adolescent years, that's where I was born and raised.
Wow, it's I guess when people think of Colombia, it might not be the first thing that people imagine, right? Like a Chinese immigrant family.
Right, right. Especially right off the bat, right? I mean, now not so much. Now there's a pretty big Chinese population. I wouldn't say almost everywhere in Latin America, but back then we were literally the only Chinese restaurant in the city.
Wow.
We're the only. I mean, just the name of the restaurant itself, Restaurante China. I mean, how generic is that? It's like super generic for super direct. You already know what kind of food you're gonna get, right? So yeah, it was like literally the Chinese restaurant, in town. And I guess, yeah, I mean, it was one of the things that we became known for since we're the first ones there. And I mean, even it's so funny because when I started going to UCI and I took a class in East Asian Studies, and it kind of touched on, I guess, the communist China experience. There were some novels that were under, in our discussion sections, where they talked about, that crazy, the oh God, the Mao Revolution, right? And I guess on my mom's side of the family, and my mom used to talk about this all the time, but as a kid, I would always roll my eyes because, like, oh God, yes, I get it. You used to walk 20 miles in the snow and all that to get to school. Um, but it was kind of funny because once I started reading some of that material in college, all of those stories that my mom used to tell me about her childhood really started to ring a bell. Just to fill you in on it, so on my mom's side, she has a very big family. I want to say about 8 siblings. So it was really really big, especially for a Chinese family. And this was, pre the Great Revolution and all that. Um, I guess my, I guess her family could be considered a wealthy family for that era, because I guess my great grandfather had done the same thing. He went outside of China to go make some money, and apparently, I guess he was like something like an XO or first mate in some kind of a cruise. I don't want to say cruise ship, but some kind of a ship or boat or something. And he came back with a lot of money, which is how ended up buying a big house, being able to take care and support a really large extended family and all that. And then once the Mao Revolution came in, it's like those were the families, those were the people that were targeted because you're living
Mm.
a lot better than the common man, right? And so they got stripped of everything. They got stripped of all of their belongings and whatnot. Half, the 5 older siblings. My mom was the youngest daughter in her family, and she had 2 younger siblings, two younger brothers. At that time, I believe she told me she was 7 or 8 years old. Um, my grandmother, her mother, was a nurse, so she was pretty well educated as well too. And because she was a nurse, I guess she was in one of those very desirable occupations.
Hmm.
But I guess they tried to flee, but only half the family made it to Hong Kong. So my grandfather and the 5 older siblings were the ones who make it to Hong Kong. My grandmother, my mom, and her 2 younger brothers were stuck on the other side for a number of, I
Wow.
want to say for a couple of years at least. And then during that time, I guess people were selling each other out, right? There was a lot of blacklisting going on at that time. It's like, hey, you're a radical or whatnot, and yeah, I guess my great grandfather passed away during that time because I guess it broke his heart to see the family being completely separated, destroyed. Everything he had worked for had been taken away, had been confiscated by the communist government. Not to disparage, China in any way, but hey, that's what I understand from our family history.
Right.
And I guess at that point, my mom, she was 8, and they were living pretty much in poverty. My mom would tell me how they would, jump fences and try to pick whatever fruit they could, from whatever field they were able to find. And what a funny thing is, whenever we're at the dinner table and whenever we're eating fish, my mom would always go straight for the fish bones. She'd save all of the meat, all of the stuff, because that's the way she grew up. That's what she, as the old, from that half of the family, as the oldest child, again, she was 8, she had to leave all the meat for her younger siblings, who were, what, 3, 5 years old, I guess. She had to leave all the meat, and I guess she grew a liking for it. And it's so funny because to this day, whenever we're sitting around the dinner table and we're eating fish, she'll go straight for the head, she'll go straight for the bones. That's her thing, and I guess she has a liking for it, but it's just out of pure habit that she ended up doing that. But anyway, yeah, I guess shortly after that, um, somebody had tossed down the rumor that my grandmother, who was a nurse, had badmouthed the government or had spoken against the government. And I guess she got arrested and she got taken to a work camp, to a labor camp. So my mom and her brothers were on their own. I want to say they were on their own for a few months. My mom makes it sound like years, but then the math doesn't add up. But she was a child back then, so it would feel like years, right? If you think about it. And she mentioned how when my grandmother was let out of the labor camp, she was completely changed. Her health was very seriously affected. And when I was growing up, and whenever I met my grandmother in Hong Kong, the few times that we took a trip to Hong Kong, I always remember her being in the hospital. I always remember her being laid up in bed. I've not once ever seen her on her feet. Throughout my entire life. And I guess that was a byproduct of what had happened in those labor camps. But anyway, long story short, I guess I'm thinking maybe when my mom was around 10 years old, the border to Hong Kong had opened up. And I forget my history. Somebody's going to correct me on this, and please, by all means, correct me on it. But I guess the borders were open for like a week where people were allowed to travel across the bay over to Hong Kong. And that's how, her family got reunited. But I guess the bridge was so overpacked, it was so overcrowded that unless you were the first ones there, it was almost impossible to get across. And so I guess she mentioned she had a cousin. They tied on whatever floating devices they had, and they swam across the bay. That's how they literally, and she wasn't they weren't the only ones. There were a whole ton of people that were trying to get, if they had a boat, great, but if they didn't have a boat, you tie, flotate, whatever, anything that floats around your body, and you just wade across, wade across the Hong Kong harbor, which is pretty nuts, pretty insane. And it's so funny because, again, going back to the East Asian studies that I took in college, I read some of these books, I read some of these stories, and that really hit home because somebody else did the exact same thing that my mom had described. And at that point, I had a whole different appreciation for my roots at that point, or at least her story. But I guess when she was in Hong Kong, she grew up to be a teacher. So now you know where it came from. Okay, the whole educational background experience. She grew up to be a teacher in Hong Kong and everything, and then my father and my mother, they had met back when they were in the mainland, and they separated, but I guess they got back together in Hong Kong somewhere along the lines. They were childhood buddies. And Yeah, ultimately, going back to the point in Colombia, they were still in communication with each other. They were still very, very close. They intended to get married. I guess at that point where he felt he was pretty well established, my dad asked my mother to travel across, come to Colombia, even though she didn't speak a lick of Spanish. And they got married there. They had us there. But it was also interesting because I guess there was shortly after I was born, I guess there was some kind of a conflict with his partner at the restaurant, and his partner was trying to muscle him out or something like that. And my father's Spanish was very limited. My mother's Spanish was non-existent, and she just had me. And they were living on the second floor of the restaurant, you know. And I guess they had a falling out. Him and my father and his partner had some kind of a falling out, and I guess the partner somehow sent the cops after my father. So in the middle of the night, they just showed up after hours. Police knocked on the door, and police in Colombia, they look more like military police.
Yeah.
Everybody walks around with an M16. You know,
Right. Right.
you're an enforcement, right? Um, and my mom had never seen this. I mean, she grew up around communist China, but still, it's like this is a whole different experience. And they just came in, took my dad, and she was left on her own. Couldn't speak the language, just had a baby, and
Wow.
everything, which was crazy. Luckily, my dad had some friends. We connected with I guess a Japanese family. Because back then, it's like Asians. There's very few Asians in Colombia, and birds of a feather flock together. Even though, regardless of history or whatnot, it's like, okay, well, you're Asian, I'm Asian too. We come from
Right.
generally the same area, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Like, all
Right.
right, well, you look for other people to support each other, right? And they came to my mom's help. They could speak Spanish, and to this day we're still very close. I grew up around their kids and everything, so we still connect. But yeah, I guess they came to my mother's rescue. They managed to get my dad out, and from that point on, I mean, yeah, we had a fairly good, decent life. I mean, the business did good. My parents worked really hard. We expanded the restaurant from one restaurant. It went to a chain of 4 restaurants, in the region. So we did pretty well, and ultimately the ultimate goal was to migrate to the United States. That was always the ultimate goal. It's always the idea of Maycall. It's like it being the land of gold, land of riches and freedom, and all of that, right?
Right.
And back then there were a lot of anti-Chinese laws that would prevent my family from being able to directly immigrate to the U.S. Right? But eventually, when they had more means, when they had more resources, we made our way, to the U.S. And that was when I was 9 years old. My brother, I have one brother. He's 2 years younger than me, so he was 7 years old when we did the move from Colombia to the U.S. But
Wow.
yeah, it was something.
Bro, just yeah, I'm a little bit speechless right here. Like this, just hearing like everything your family had to go through. Just let me structure my thinking because I feel like there's this belief in the English speaking world that people always want to migrate to the US immediately, right? When sometimes, even though that may be the end goal, that's not exactly how that journey begins for, I would say, maybe
How it
most
happens,
people, right?
right?
So, bro, like, wow, like just hearing the history of your parents and your grandparents and everything they had to go through, I cannot imagine the suffering and traumas they went through, and then just even up to the point where your mom like moves across the entire Pacific Ocean to be with your dad, has you, and then is in this like awful situation where your dad's imprisoned, and then luckily, like you said, there was a sort of community there that helped her out. But my respect to your mom and your parents, bro. Like I'm sort of speechless, Hugo. Like you never shared this story with me before, so this is wow, bro. Like I can only imagine how much appreciation and admiration you must have for your parents.
You know what I did? Now my mother frustrates the hell out of me because she's getting older and she's deaf, and she was always hard to communicate with, and this only makes it
Mm-hmm.
so much better.
Right, right, right. Well,
But yeah, yeah, but yeah, I remember. Yeah, I mean, when I started coming into my own, I guess in college, it's like I really began to appreciate those stories. It's like again, you grow up with your mom telling you, oh, you should eat your food. It's like, oh, you kids are so spoiled. You get
mm-hmm.
driven to school. You have a bus picking you up. All of that stuff. Like
Right.
I used to walk in the snow barefoot, yada yada yada, all of that stuff. You like I said, you roll your eyes on it, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's funny how you realize how much of a dick you were when you were rolling your eyes as a kid at that time. When you get confirmation that hey, this actually
Wow. That's crazy. Wait, so let me go a little bit back before you go into college and all that. So how how old were you when you left Colombia to move to the US?
I was 9 years old.
9 years
and
old.
and
Okay.
it's kind of funny, yeah. And I guess to fill you in on a little bit of my background, since we're going to be touching upon it a little bit later on as well too. I mean, like, um, yeah, as a child, obviously, I grew up around Chinese, and I want to say, like, I guess to preface it, when it comes down to like, I don't know how to quite define this. I mean, people of mixed ethnicities or cultures, I guess.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's a real term for that or
Right,
whatnot.
right.
People like you and me, who grew up in a lot of different backgrounds or whatnot. I've always been of the belief that language is something that helps shape that identity, you know? And when I was young, and I still have a few memories of like, it's like back when you're like maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years old or whatever, these small little glimpses of memory that pop up, right? I do remember speaking in Cantonese more. I remember using Chinese more. I remember my mom being there, bathing me or whatnot, or going to the park with me. Like I get these little glimpses of memories from back then. And I remember that the language that we used was Chinese, was Cantonese. However, um, my mom was a workhorse, and again, you probably know where I get it from. Gee, my parents were always working; they were always at work. It's like it's very old school back then. And if you've ever been in the restaurant business, it's a 24-hour job. If you own a restaurant, you get no vacation. There's no such thing
Hmm.
as a day off. You're always working, in some way, shape, or form. And this is pre-digital tools, right? Back then, everything was a paper pencil operation. You do things physically. So yeah, I mean, she was always working, and because of that, I grew up around nannies, and it's kind of funny. It's interesting when I talk about nannies here in the U.S. because nannies are such a luxury,
Hmm.
but in Colombia, in Latin America, housekeepers and nannies are an everyday thing. Everybody has a nanny. The nanny has a nanny.
Right, right. No, it's
Yeah,
true.
yeah. The
Everybody has,
housekeeper has a
yeah,
housekeeper.
everybody has like a house helper of some kind.
Right. Exactly. It's like everybody. It doesn't matter like what your socioeconomic level is. It's like everybody. It's just a question of how many. How many housekeepers and nannies you have in your household. That's what tells you whether or not somebody's rich or not.
Hmm.
You know. But yeah. But anyway, like I for the most part, I grew up not being around my parents, me and my brother. Because they were always at work. The only time we would ever see them was after 10, 11 o'clock at night, because that's when they would get home. And we would get like maybe an hour because we were staying up late, you know, most of the time. And again, when you leave kids on their own, like their idea of bedtime is whenever you feel sleepy, right? And my parents were always working, so they were always exhausted, so they couldn't really oversee that. And I remember my language changing more and more to Spanish, right? Because that's what you learn at school. I was lucky to have grown up being put in an international private school. I believe the name of it was Bolivar back in the day, after Simon Bolivar. But yeah, I they were pretty much a full immersion English school where after kinder, in order to communicate with your teachers, you had to use English. So
Oh,
the
okay.
so the majority of instruction was done in English, American English. And we did get a couple of Spanish periods, with the Spanish teacher as well too. But for the most part, everything was in English. So the transition for me to come to the U.S. was not such a big transition because I already felt very comfortable in using
Okay.
English.
That makes
You know,
sense. That makes
um,
sense.
right? But yeah, but I would like to say that back then, yeah, my primary language was Spanish. When I would speak to my parents, even to this day, we only use Spanish. Very
Mm,
rarely do we ever use Cantonese. As an adult, I only used my Cantonese to communicate with my grandparents,
I see.
and that was it. After my
And
grandparents passed away, yeah, I
okay.
practically never used my Cantonese.
So your Cantonese is rather limited just based on the first, like I guess, like primary years of your life, like that you had with the
Yes.
interactions with your mom. Okay. So let me ask you something. Um, did you ever notice or did you ever feel like, because I imagine growing up and you're speaking the language and you're interacting with the culture around you, and I, even though you said you did have a community of Chinese people that you grew up with in Colombia, did you ever feel or notice like, hey, I'm Colombian, but I'm a little bit different? Like like how did you have that realization?
It, I mean, yeah, it was always noticeable. Even as a child, it was always
Hmm.
noticeable because it's like number one. Outside of the U.S., it's people label each other very easily. They're quick to labeling, and so I was the little chinito. You know,
Yeah,
um,
the most obvious
yeah,
nickname they
always
could give you, right?
right, exactly, which is natural, and it's not to say. I mean, like if we did that here in the U.S., that would be super offensive, right?
Right. Yeah.
But over there, no, nobody meant. Uh, there was no malice behind it. Yes, it was a label, but it didn't feel like anybody was trying to really demean me, or at least not, purposefully demean me. But it was just
Right. Right.
something that was just generally accepted, generally done. You
Right.
know,
Did they
um,
add
but
the diminutive, the diminutivo instead of like
oh, of course.
chinito?
Well, I was the little guy.
To smooth
But
it out, they use the little diminutive in the end.
right, and there would always be that those racial insults being thrown around. The
Hmm.
stretching of the eyes, the ching chong
Hmm.
ching kind of thing.
Right.
That you know people do, right? Especially kids. Kids are mean.
Right.
Um, but I mean, yeah, definitely. Did I feel that I was different? Yeah, yeah, for sure. I knew I was different. I mean, there were a few other Koreans around and Japanese around, and again, I mentioned that I grew up around close Japanese friends, so that's why like in our family we've always had, even though like historically there's always been like this tension between China and Japan. Um, my family, we've always had a very, very good opinion towards Japanese because our
Right.
experience had always been positive.
Right.
Our personal experience had never been negative. They came to our
Mm.
rescue. They came to my mom's rescue. We've always
Right.
watched each other's backs, throughout the years and everything. My mom, to this day, they're her best friends, you
Right.
know.
It,
Um,
it, Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It's just that you brought something up to mind, and I think it also relates to like why and you and I get along. I feel like there's this thing with people that are Asian or have some Asian background in Latin America. I To me, I feel like anybody I meet who's of Asian background, no matter from where in Latin America, so long as they speak Spanish, I have a tendency to be like, "Tú eres mi primo," like you're my cousin, no matter what. Like we have this kind of
Yeah,
weird because
there's a sort of kinship.
right, it's true though because I always seem to gravitate to people like that, and it's really it's like you said they don't. I think because they had a shared sort of experience immigrating to such different cultures and countries, even the little things that they could have in common as far as historical and cultural background, like that was enough to bond them and be like, we sort of still understand each other, and we should kind of stick together and help each other out. I find that to be everywhere I've come across people from like a Latino Asian background. So I don't know if that's been your experience as well. It sounds like it has been.
It has. It has. I mean, especially back then. I mean, yeah. I mean, I like I said, like around school, I would meet these other Korean kids or Chinese kids, and of course, they would be in that international school because you tend to put them. You know, again, people tend to flock. You know, um, even though we're so different, you try to look for any scrap of commonality,
Right.
that you can. And so yeah, so I was kind of like I grew up in that way, and um, yeah, I remember when we did make the move into the U.S. First we went to Miami, because that's what Colombians do. It's
That's
closest to
true.
Colombia,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Even to this day,
It's
you
so
know.
true though.
Um,
A lot of
yeah,
Colombians in Miami. It's so true.
there's a humongous Colombian population in Colombian presence in Florida, in Miami,
Yeah.
it's Miami specifically.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, just because of just because it's close by.
Yeah.
It's
No, that makes sense.
distance.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, at that time, my parents, I guess they didn't even tell us too. A bunch of jerks. We had no idea we were moving to the U.S. They didn't even tell us. They just enrolled us in school mid year. You know,
Whoa.
and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is home now. you know, um, and it was just for the longest time. It was just me, my brother, and our nanny.
Mm-hmm.
Because she came with us.
Oh wow. Okay.
Um, yeah, and to this day, our nanny, she's more. I mean, she's a member of the family. She lives in my household. She's watching after my kid now. She's my kid's nanny now. You know, which is fun, generational, right?
Right. Right.
But yeah, like it's such a funny thing because um, I guess my parents, like they themselves could not make the move to the U.S. yet, but they sent their kids ahead of them.
Mm.
Which is so funny because if you think about it now, it's like that would not work. That would not fly because my nanny, she didn't even speak English. I had to take care of all of that stuff when I was 9 years
Whoa.
old or 10 years
Whoa.
old. Anytime we had to communicate, it was me. You know,
Wow.
so so
You're
yeah, it's
blowing
like
my
when you
mind
think
here,
about
dude.
it. Right. And this would be at the same age that my kid is. And I can't imagine myself doing that to my kid. Like,
Yeah.
I, you know, it
Yeah.
sends a chill down my spine just even thinking about it.
Yeah. But imagine the amount of trust your parents, the amount of trust and love they must have had for your nanny to like, you know, leave you to her care and trusting in the fact that she would protect you despite the fact that she
Right.
didn't speak the language, and then wow, and then like a lot of Latino kids, you were endowed with the responsibility of handling from basic conversation to legal documentation.
Right. Right. I mean, I didn't even realize it was legal. You just, hey, say this, right?
Right,
you
right,
know,
right, right.
you have no idea. As a kid, you have no idea about the gravity of whatever it is that you're reading, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Or who you're
Wow. Hey,
talking to.
dude, so how at that point, like would you have identified yourself, like how did you identify yourself as a kid? Because I don't know that you think much about this as when you're growing up. at least? Like, did you in your mind were you like, I'm Colombian, that's it, or I'm Chinese and I'm Colombian, or I'm Chinese and now I'm going to be American? Like, how did you
No,
even
when I
how did that encapsulate that in your mind at the time?
so I want to say this was like roughly 84, 85, 86.
Mm-hmm.
Roughly at about that time. And I don't know, if you remember that time period, especially like on TV, there's
Oh
this
yeah,
big thing, the Godzilla marathons and the Kung Fu marathons, right?
right,
And
right, right.
early Jackie Chan movies and whatnot, right? A lot of
All the
Bruce
good
Lee
stuff.
marathons going on
All
here.
the good stuff.
Right, exactly. Which is great, right? You had the American Ninja series coming out and all that stuff. And it was so funny because I would take pride, even though I had never taken any martial arts as a kid. I would take
Mm-hmm.
pride that kung fu was inherent to me, you know,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
because that was the craze back then, right?
Yeah, yeah. You know what's
so,
funny
so
though?
as a
I
kid,
sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought, and I'll jump
no, no,
back
no,
on
go
mine.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. Go
Dude,
ahead.
it's so crazy that you say that because you know because I have family that looks Asian and I don't, but I grew up with an uncle that put all those movies that you just mentioned. He would love watching like Bruce Lee and all these, Chuck Norris, but mostly he
Oh
was a
yeah,
giant Bruce Lee fan. And I remember thinking to myself, like, somehow my genes, even though I don't look like him, connect in some way to
right.
this. And for me, to be honest with you, it's one of the reasons I actually started practicing martial arts for that reason, because I'm like, this is something that comes from back in my grandfather's and great grandfather's like place of origin, so it's really weird that even though you don't do it, somehow, like you said, it's somehow ingrained in you, like it's a part of
Right. For
you.
some reason, you feel like you're supposed to be connected to it.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, but I mean, I'm wondering if it's because you don't really see people in the communities or your family that like are represented in television, especially back then.
Mm,
Like that was like, oh, this is my superhero. Like this is this
that's
is
true.
this is something like I can, like, oh yeah, like there are some people that look like my uncle and my grandpa, and that like can like put foot to
Yeah,
ass. It's
yeah.
not
For
just
some
Chuck
weird ways,
Norris.
like we tend to, right? We gravitated towards that a little bit
Yeah,
more, for lack of better words.
sure.
It's like okay, I didn't. I mean, I did watch, back then WWF, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah,
What kid wouldn't watch it?
yeah.
But
Lucha libre.
more often than not, I would gravitate towards those kung fu movies, more
Yes.
and everything.
One
You
hundred
know,
percent. One
um,
hundred percent.
yeah. So I felt like okay, maybe like all right, this is kind of, I guess in some way, like this is me being in there, right? This is me being
Mm-hmm.
represented, in
Mm-hmm.
the media and everything. Which is something why, and again, kids being kids, it's like they would say when they would look at me, they'd go whoa, kind of thing, like the whole kung fu thing or
Right, right.
whatnot. Like okay, well, yeah, it's like watch out, he can kick your ass. You're right, you can kick your ass. You better step away.
It's so
you know.
funny.
Uh,
It's so funny.
Yeah,
So
right.
yeah.
But to go back to answering your question, I don't think I ever back then. If I'm thinking back when I was that little 9-year-old Hugo, and I still identified as Hugo back then. Um, you know, it, I thought I was both. I thought I
Okay.
was a little bit of both. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't quite see myself as full Colombian. I did see myself as, but I think that's when I started identifying more as Chinese
Mm-hmm.
or Asian,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Um, but, and as for being Colombia, I mean, even my parents kept us very, for lack of a better word, sheltered, you know? So we didn't really, to be honest with you, we didn't really have that many close Colombian friends,
I
you
see.
know, which is why to this day I'm the worst salsa dancer you could probably ever. I am the worst example of a Colombian there could ever be, you know. Uh, so yeah, other than eating the food,
Yeah.
I'm probably the one single worst example. But yeah, I guess yeah, there were stuff that I identified to, but I don't think as a whole I ever labeled myself as anything. Not
Okay.
back then, anyway.
I mean, it's hard, right? Especially at that age. But I often wonder, because I was clearly labeled as one thing, right? But for someone
Right.
that looks different but grew up in a culture that, even though they might identify with, they may people may view them as different just because of their appearance, right? So it's interesting to hear. It's cool to hear that you identified with both either way. Um, do you how has that changed throughout your life? I mean, like, I know I'm jumping way ahead, and we'll go back because there's still some stuff I want to ask you. But how has that changed throughout the years compared to now? How do you identify as now? And even considering that I know now you're married and you have a little girl, like, did that influence who you chose as a spouse? Do you think that helped, or that in some way influenced? What do you think?
I think it would have, I mean, again, the whole birds of a feather, right? Um, uh, well, I mean, puberty, obviously, like, brings up all sorts of new things, and you start wondering, like, you grow up and you start wanting to become your own person, right? I think that's probably the one big thing that helps define puberty, right? Trying to
Mm-hmm.
find who you are as a person, right? And it's funny because then you start self-labeling. You
Mm,
start labeling yourself at that point. You know, because you want to belong, right?
right.
You want to belong to something, and during our generation, right? We're what, second generation at that point. In the '90s, I guess, growing, you could feel the racial awareness. I think started to really, really start to become a thing, right? In the early '90s, I want to say. And it was so funny because, yeah, I guess at that point, I started wondering about myself more. It's like, what exactly am I? And I would feel this with I mean, taking a step back a little bit, I would feel this with my interactions with some of my relatives because I could not connect very well with a lot of my relatives, my
Mm,
uncles and aunts, my cousins, even. I grew up not having an accent because oh, I grew up with English for most of my life. So I picked it up fairly early in life, right? Some of my cousins did not. They came from China or they came from the mainland, and they still had a pretty heavy accent, you know. And so already my brother and I were different, as kids, with the relatives and everything. It's like my brother and I, we were the ones to really, really, everybody noticed. Everybody noticed we were different, and everybody had to talk to us differently because our Cantonese wasn't there either, right? They would either talk to us in Spanish or they would talk to us in English. Um, but already it felt like I was not Chinese at that point.
mm.
I did not feel that I was Chinese. I was not made to feel that I was Chinese. Other than my grandma, reminding me I was Chinese. you know, um, it's like, don't forget, you're Chinese. It's like,
Right,
you need
right.
to marry a Chinese girl. That sort of thing. Uh, eat the soup,
Right,
kind
right.
of thing. Right.
How did you feel
But
about
yeah,
that?
like,
Like, how did that make you feel? Like, understanding, like, okay, sure, maybe by blood I'm Chinese, but I don't necessarily feel like I can share, I guess, like, partake fully culturally. Like, I feel more like I'm part of this new place that I'm in, or maybe both, where the culture I grew up in, and the place where I'm at now. Like, how did you feel about that? Did that make you feel like
yeah.
sad or disconnected? Like, how?
I'm not so sure I want to say I felt sad or anything. Disconnected, yes.
Mhm.
Um, you feel like an outsider, right?
Mm,
Like, you're at family gatherings and everything like that, and you're not the same. You can't be 100% of part of the conversation, right? So it felt like I didn't have a voice in that as well too. Whenever we were at big family gatherings, and stuff. So even to this day, like I hardly ever connect with my extended family. You know, I just we feel very little connection to each other other than from my mother. You know, um, but yeah, I mean, I for sure I felt different, and I know my brother felt the same way as well too, because his Cantonese was a lot worse than mine back then. He ended up marrying a Chinese girl, so now his Cantonese blows mine out of the water. But um, yeah, I would say like growing up like that, I for lack of better words, and I know that's not accurate, I felt like the black sheep of the family. Not because I acted, not because I did anything wrong. I don't think,
Hmm.
or I did anything illegal or anything. I just felt like I was the different one. You know, I was the different one in there.
Right.
That's what it felt like.
Sure. Did you feel like it was a bit of a like an internal conflict, or was it just something that you were like, no, that's okay, I'm just different, and that's what it is? Like, how did you feel?
I think a little both. I don't think it was ever one or the other. I
Hmm.
think it was a little bit of both. You know, when I thought about it, because I didn't really blame them either.
Right.
I didn't feel I didn't feel bitter about it, but I
Hmm.
did feel weird sometimes, and those feelings became even stronger as you become a teen. Because I remember like I think this was when my mom's my grandfather had passed away, and the whole family came here. We had the funeral here in the U.S. and everything. And back then, I was into basketball. I was playing basketball, playground basketball all the time and everything. And I remember my uncles decided to go out to the playground, the park playground, actually the YMCA. And there were a couple of people from high school that I knew that were there. And oh my God, my uncles, it was embarrassing. They almost like picked a fight with these bigger high school kids or whatnot, and then my cousins got into it too, and I was the one trying to keep the peace, and that's where I felt a little embarrassed about
Uh-huh.
my Chinese roots, because they were, for lack of better words, they were acting very Chinese,
Okay.
when it came down to the conflict,
Right,
right?
right, right.
And I was just like, oh God, it's like, okay, I don't know if it was shame at them being older and picking a fight with a high school, which was probably it, or
Right.
if there was like a Chinese component to that as well too.
Uh-huh.
I don't know what it was, but yeah, it was just weird. It was very very weird.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. So, do you feel that maybe because of that difference, um, like it benefited you in some way, or like it held you back in some way?
I don't feel it ever held me back, but I would like to say neither. It's just the
Hmm.
way you grow up, right? Um, for sure, when it came down to my friendships, I tended to gravitate more to Asians. But then again, we lived in the San Gabriel Valley. I mean,
Right.
the San Gabriel Valley is full of Asians. There's no way around it.
Sure.
So I don't know if that affected it as well too, you know. But I did. I mean, if I look back in life, yeah, most of my friends tend to be Asians, Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess as I went more towards my being a teenager, middle school, high school, and everything, I started identifying more as Asian American.
Okay.
The hyphen American started to kick in more.
Right.
You
Right.
know, where
Okay.
I knew there was. I mean, primarily I identified as Asian. And on paper, like even on the census, on any census document or whatever, it's like, what do you claim to be? Asian, right?
Hmm.
There's no hyphen American to any of those
Right.
choices,
Right.
right?
There's no like Asian,
Um,
Colombian, American.
right,
Right. Right.
right. Like even Hispanic, do you identify as Hispanic or not? I could never understand why was that ever the first question. It's like why is it important to say whether or not you're Hispanic or not as
Right.
the first question, and then after that, it's like, okay, well, which of these choices do you identify with? I
Yeah.
could never understand the purpose for that.
Do you
You
ever
know,
check both? Like, You know, like when you're applying for a job or something, like I'm Hispanic,
I was
but
always
I'm
very
also
picky
Asian,
too.
but I'm also like American. Like, dude.
Right, right. At the beginning, I did. At the beginning, I was like, "Which one am I?" Like when the
Mm,
first time I saw that census, a form,
mm-hmm,
I was wondering, like, well, I was born in Colombia, so
mm-hmm.
I have Colombian citizenship,
Right.
but what are they asking me?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you have this moment of confusion, and you're wondering,
Yeah.
like, how do I fill this out?
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I guess growing up, as an adolescent, you have those moments, and then as you get closer and closer towards going to college, you start that hyphen American really starts to set in, you know. But again, it's a very blurred line. You can't really say like, oh well, how are you American? I guess in the language and the mannerisms, you know. But culturally, traditionally, what you do at New Year's, what you do at, when it's time to, Lunar New Year, what is it that you do? What is it that you eat? You're back to being Asian again. you know, there was a lot of that jumping back and forth.
Right. Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like I find that with other people of Asian background in different Latin American countries, it's very similar kind of stories that you're telling me. The only difference is sometimes like yeah, when it's Chinese New Year, we have like like what is it called, like arepas or tamales or
Hmm.
whatever. Pick the Latin American
Yeah,
country they
yeah.
come from, along with Chinese food, right? Did we get cut off? I think we got no. You can still hear me?
I think we're lagging. Yeah, we're lagging for a little bit.
Ah, okay, yeah, okay. So it doesn't it didn't sound like you had too much of it, because I know some people they say like I had a little bit of an identity crisis or something like that, and I kind of get it, but at the same time I'm like, why do you have to pick one, right? And it sounds like you sort of
Right.
took that approach.
Right. I mean, I already knew I wasn't one or the other.
Right.
There was no way. There was no way I could be one or the other. Right. Physically, I'm not one way.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Language wise, I'm not the other way either. you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
because my Cantonese was pathetic. Right. But my Spanish, though, and my Spanish, I managed to retain my act. People say I still retain my accent. Right. And I'll have to take their word for it. Now, keep in mind that my Spanish stayed with me at the 9-year-old level, right? Because I never used it beyond the 9-year-old level. I never studied it, I never studied anything, any course in the Spanish language, using
Mm-hmm.
the Spanish language, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
never developed that larger vocabulary or the more refined language, Spanish language that goes with it. But I had conversational Spanish for the most part, and I could read to some extent. I could write, but I never had really the formal writing practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's like just whatever I remembered from grade school. That was pretty much it. And it's so funny because I remember when I started working. I was 15. My first job was working at Round Table Pizza, if you remember those.
Yeah.
But I only did that for a short bit, and then my friend, his dad worked at Bank of America in Monterey Park, and it's a very mixed crowd in Monterey Park. Automatically, you think it's going to be a Chinese crowd, but no, there were a lot of Hispanic Latino crowds at that branch, at that
Mm-hmm.
office, and you would see them the most, during when Social Security checks came out, because everybody came over at the beginning of the month to cash their Social Security checks, right? All It doesn't matter what ethnicity they were, they all
Yeah.
came at the
They
same
all
time,
came.
because that's when Social Security issued the checks. you know, so I started working there as a teller, and I mean, obviously, everybody saw me. He's like, "Oh, he's Asian. He's an ABC. American-born Chinese. He's a banana." It's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, sure." And so, like I would get teased at how bad my Cantonese was, and I would try to use it too with the older Chinese grandma and grandpa until like the teller next to me went, "Oh, step aside, you're hurting my ears." You know, you know. But then when it came down to the Spanish grandma or grandpa, when they came over, it's like, all right, I can handle this,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
like my Spanish would just flow, and that was kind of like a point of pride for my boss,
Sure.
my manager, because I had the China boy who could speak Spanish,
Right, right.
and not just speak Spanish, but he could speak Spanish,
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Did
Um,
you did were
so,
people surprised when you came up to them when they came up to you and they were like, "Whoa, like he's just
oh yeah,
fluently
you always
going
see
off."
that.
Yeah.
Right. And usually I wouldn't try to showcase it or anything. It's like I would start with English first, and if they struggled, then I would switch.
Hmm.
Or if it was very apparent like they would feel more at ease with me switching languages, then it would, and then you would see like, oh, their eyes open up. You always get that same, look. It's like, oh, you speak Spanish. How did you learn it? It's like, I was born in Colombia. I'd give them
Right.
a little bit of background.
Ah,
Because it,
okay.
it didn't feel right telling them, oh, I'm a really smart student. No.
I'm gifted.
Right. I could have played it off that way. I'm a language prodigy or something, but it didn't feel right doing that. You know, I just,
Right.
no, no, no. I had an unfair advantage. It's just the way I grew up. you know. Um, so yeah, and what was interesting to me was, it's like, when this one, what was it? This one gentleman, I can't remember where he was from, but I was helping him out, and I was trying to get him to put in his PIN number, into the terminal and everything after he slid his debit card, his ATM card. And like I remember, it's like, okay, oprima el botón, por favor, entre la clave ahí en la máquina, por favor. And he said like, oh, yeah, well, for sure you're not Mexican, you know, because he said like I used the word oprimir,
Hmm.
and normally people would say empuchar,
Hmm.
right?
Empujar, yeah,
So
yeah, for sure.
right, exactly. So it's like a little bit more on the formal side, I guess you could
Hmm.
say.
Hmm.
Um, and then from talking to them, all of a sudden he just went, "You're from Colombia, aren't you? You're from Cali." He knew the city I was from. I never told him, and
Wow.
I was so surprised. And I asked him, "How did you know?" This was my turn to be surprised, right? Because
Uh-huh.
he looked at me, and I immediately identified the city I was born. Um, and he said it's your accent. I've heard it. I lived in Cali before. He
Uh-huh.
wasn't Colombian, but he lived there, and
Hmm.
he recognized my accent. You
Wow.
know,
Oh, that's cool.
and he was the only person to date that ever nailed me like that.
That's crazy.
Like just right off the bat. So that was something. That was interesting.
Oh,
But
that's a
but
pretty
I
cool
was,
experience,
I
though.
guess, right. It was very very cool. I mean, like I was, oh my god, really? I speak like that? You know. But yeah, I guess at that point, my Colombian, for lack of better words, my Colombian heritage or my Colombian background, um, kind of took a backseat and became a novelty.
Mm.
I guess in my ethnic identity,
Hmm.
if so to speak.
Sure.
Because okay, now physically Asian came to the forefront, but the dash American was starting to come more. It started to feel more like American dash Asian, American dash
Right.
Chinese,
Yes. Right. Right. For sure.
like as far as the order goes. But for sure, the Colombians started taking a backseat. Started taking a big backseat to everything. And it's not until I meet Colombians that it tends to come back to the forefront. And I don't know if it's because when I'm speaking to more Latinos, I guess, that they want to connect with me as a Colombian.
Mm.
You know,
I see. Yeah. And but do you feel it though? Like, do you feel like I guess that Colombian part of you, like it comes out and you're like, oh, but I am this as well.
it kind of does. It kind of does at times. But again, I'm such a poor example of a Colombian. That I'm a little bit ashamed at how little I know about Colombia. You know, and Colombian culture, especially Colombian culture. And I know so little of it because my education was so sparse, right? Technically speaking, there's nobody other than me and my brother. There's nobody really Colombian in our household, other than and our nanny.
Wow.
You know,
Yeah. Wow. So for sure you had a different experience than everybody else in your family. It really sounds like. You had a
Yeah,
very
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of different, at least a different angle compared to everyone else.
Yes, yes, that is true. That is very, very true. Because I couldn't really fully identify in one way or the other, but for sure the Americans started
Mm,
taking a more, started being more in the forefront. Like when people, and I think that's when I started responding more as I'm an American. You know, like
right.
what are you,
Yeah.
a human? American. And it's so funny because like I would listen to some of my coworkers or friends, like I guess those like some of the older, and you see, I think I saw that more being a teller at a bank, because you see a lot, you're exposed to more different generations and a lot more people. And like I remember like when I guess one customer, um, tall older white guy referred to us as Orientals, and I remember my coworker making the comment, "What am I, a rug?" You know, kind of thing. Um, right, and I think that's when then again I feel that that's when the American part of it really started taking over. As far as my cultural or ethnic identity went.
Right. Okay.
And it's so funny. I'm going to add to that story
Hmm.
by so to answer the question. Well, where did Hugh Kingston come from? And I think I told you this story, but like yeah, like it was during like high school that my parents, they were already separated. They were going through a separation, divorce, and everything. And it was not a very nice separation or divorce. And there was a lot of vying for power, a lot of vying for for favor from their children. And I guess I know it seems petty right now, but as a kid, I really wanted to have a car. That was our thing back then. And my mom promised me a car, and then dad promised me a car, and they both did it. They would either one of them would take me to the dealer, which is horrible for a high school kid to take a
Yeah.
kid to the dealer because you think it's actually going to happen, right?
Yeah.
But then they both didn't follow through, both of
Oh
them.
no.
So, right, exactly. So at that point, I'd had enough. And we were already, the reason why we were able to migrate to the U.S. was because of my father's parents, their grandparents. They were the ones sponsoring us. But anyway, it took a long while. We had our green card for the longest while and everything, and then finally came to the point where we were going to be naturalized. And this was during my first year of college at UC Irvine, where we're going through the full naturalization process and everything. And again, this was at the time when I was taking those East Asian studies classes, right? And I started discovering that there are more like official, I guess, for lack of better words, Asian Americans out there who went through a similar experience that I was going through, who had, and it was very common for a lot of Asians when they moved to different countries to change their names in order for to better assimilate with the new culture, right, where they're at. Like for example, my mother, she ended up changing her name to Jasmine, right? So I guess, but her legal name was still her Chinese name. Um, but anyway, I remember going through the entire naturalization process, as a freshman in college, and then I'm in there with the interview. You get to the interview portion, and it's like, okay, it's this rote, very Mickey Mouse kind of interview, for all of that and everything. And then they hand me the documents, like, okay, sign here. This is what makes it official. And then, yeah, do you want to still be known as Hugo? And that's when I look up. And that's when I begin to realize I can change it, like really change it, you know. And the guy said yes, and so I look at that paper, and my mind is racing, right, and I'm scrambling, and all those feelings of what is it, bitterness, I guess, towards my
Hmm.
parents
Hmm.
kind of came to the forefront because like they're going through that whole divorce thing and everything. And so I went, you know what, I'm gonna shape my own path, I'm gonna be my own man. and that's where Hugh Alexander Kingston was born.
I
Hugh
see.
because was a direct translation of Hugo, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and then the Alexander, I don't know, it just sounded great. It sounded like Alexander the Great, so I went, why not?
Why
It
not?
sounds good. There's a flow to it, right? And then the Kingston was because I had read a novel by Maxine Hong Kingston, you know,
Ah,
because I felt like, oh, wow, like this is one of the first Asian American writers. And, it's like, okay, there's somebody I can relate to. And I like the sound of that.
right. Right.
And
Right.
that's where, Hugh Alexander Kingston was born.
Hmm.
And I and I didn't realize the gravity of what the hell I was doing, but then at that point I was being a rebellious kid,
Right. Right.
and like then I realized, God, I gotta change everything,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
which is
For
such a
sure.
big pain in the ass. A name change is
Yeah.
a big thing, and
Hmm.
I remember surprising my parents with it, and they could not believe what I had done,
Oh boy.
both of them,
Oh boy.
which
What
was the
was? What
reaction I
was?
guess I was looking for.
Can you share a little bit of that? What was mom versus dad's
I think it was more shock.
reaction?
They did not see it coming. I didn't see it
I
coming,
see.
if I'm being honest.
Mm.
Right. It was more shock. I mean, I could tell they were a little bit upset, but they didn't yell at me about it. I think I just took them. I think it was just such a bucket of cold water in their face that they didn't know how to react to it.
Mm.
And yeah, for a number of years, it was more like, what the hell did you do this kind of thing. It's like, it's weird. I can't even, my mom can't pronounce Kingston. She keeps calling me Clinton. Yeah. So yeah, so it's pretty
Oh
hilarious.
goodness. Oh, I can only try to imagine your parents' face like when you said that, and then you were like, "Yeah," like because then, like you said, it had to hit you about like now I have to change everything, and anytime I have to request a document, like I have to refer back to my previous name and make sure I have a document to verify. Yeah.
I still have a credit card, my oldest credit card that still has my old name, Hugo Chu, on it,
Whoa.
and I have to
Wow.
explain things
Right. For sure. For
when
sure.
anybody asks me for an ID.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it
Whenever I
makes
use that
sense.
card, yeah, and I should change it. It's just such a pain in the ass to do
Yeah.
it.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. And I'm telling you this just because I removed one of my last names and I didn't realize, like, oh, I see. Like, I have to
Yeah,
do all this
it's a
stuff
big
now.
thing.
It's not even like I changed it. I just removed one of the last names because you know how in Latin America you get your father's and your mother's last name? And everybody kept referring to me by the second last name because they're like, well, this last name doesn't match your face. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not my problem. Like, that's your issue. Like, I get
Right,
it,
right.
but yeah, so oh man, just you taking me through the name change. Like, I mean, I just removed the name. You really changed it, and then it's like, yeah, it's wow. Okay, all right. I
Right.
I would
And
be
you've known me as Hugo because I didn't totally abandon Hugo either because
right.
so many people still, people who are close to me still identified me as Hugo, you know? So,
Sure.
so I kept that still, and like you and Michelle still referred to me as Hugo, but most people still refer to me as Hugh now.
Right. Okay. Wow. Interesting. Well, let me ask you something then, based off that. I guess not necessarily based off the name, but and this is a little bit on the darker side. Did you ever feel like or feel any discrimination in Colombia or in the US, or was it a different style if you did get it from both? And do you feel like that's changed from growing up to now?
I'd be lying if I said that I never had a moment of actual discrimination. It's just I didn't. I don't think I ever lingered with it too long, where I let it really bother me because in some ways, I'm always expecting it. You know, especially in Colombia, and it's happened at times. Where I was for sure treated differently, and even though I used my Spanish, I was still treated differently. You know what I
Mm,
mean? So language did not make
sure.
a difference.
Right. Right.
Even though I demonstrated that I could communicate with you better in Spanish, that person would still attempt to use either Chinese, English, even though their English was not very good. And I could tell, like, dude, we can get this conversation moving a lot faster, a lot quicker if you just listen to me, you know. Um, but yeah, but I mean, I don't want to say I ever felt. I probably did have a moment, but I don't think I can remember it now. But I don't think I ever had like a Rosa Parks kind of incident,
Right,
you
right,
know. Um, Anywhere, I think, in my life, either Colombia
right.
or anywhere else. I'm sure there was something that I was probably discriminated on.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't think I ever let it bother me because I knew to expect it, you
Sure.
know. And
Yeah.
even here in the U.S., like I know that if, yeah, I mean, I've traveled to other places, you know, that were not quite as metropolitan, you know, like driving across more like the southern states or whatnot, and I could feel it that I was, you know, in Southern California, you know, I'm not a minority. Outside of Southern California, hey, I'm a minority again,
Right, right.
you know.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, again, I don't feel like anybody owes me. I guess, like, I don't know how to put it. You know, I expect that something's going to happen,
Sure.
and that's only because, you know, believe it or not, even to this day and age, there are people who have never met an Asian person before in
Yeah.
the
No,
United States.
I believe it. I
You
believe it
know,
for sure.
yeah,
For sure.
and you get those looks, right? You get people looking at you and staring at you, and you get it more from the kids, you know, because I get it. I'm the very first Asian person you've probably ever seen,
Right.
you know.
Right. Yeah. And then
And yeah, I think
also,
like,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say, like, I remember like once, a couple of times getting the comment that you speak really good English. It's like, oh, you do
Ah,
too,
okay.
you know.
Right, 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 right. Yeah. Yeah, and in as far as that goes as well, I don't only mean that from people in the US and Colombia. Sometimes even like you said, because you don't speak Cantonese, or you're not, I guess, as in tune with your family's culture from the past, just because of the nature of your history. Did you ever feel like not necessarily completely accepted as well as in Chinese culture? Or at least, like, I guess,
Yeah,
hints of like, oh, you're not Chinese, but you are, but you're not. Because sometimes I've heard other people mention that, like, I'm not necessarily accepted in my parents' culture, even though I am part of it.
yeah. I mean, for sure, yeah, definitely. I've had those feelings. Definitely, I thought of that, and for sure, I felt it as well too. But I guess as an adult, you kind of learn to accept it, right? As an adolescent or as a teen or whatnot, or even as a high school, you know, young adult, yes, you have those feelings, but as you get older and older, you've already accepted it, you know to expect it, and you know it's not unfounded either. They're not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not Chinese. They're not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
culturally speaking, I'm far from being Chinese, right? Um, Yeah, I mean, physically, biologically, yeah, sure. If I take a 23andMe test, it's going to say, you know, and that's why I never take the test because I'm too afraid to be disappointed. It's only going to show one color in that pie chart, with maybe a
Oh.
smidge of something else here and there. You know, that's really the true reason why I never take any of those, you know, DNA tests,
Uh-huh.
because I'm more afraid that it's going to be a waste of money. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. No, I get it. I get it. Wow. Okay. So, I know, like, times I imagine it's much. I guess here. Let me start again. When I think of those situations, I often wonder if younger generations maybe had less of I guess those sort of situations, just because I feel like younger kids are much more exposed to so many different cultures now, and I feel like there's way more mixed families now than when at least I was growing up. And I'm sure that even people that were a generation before me, it was even less for them. So I'm wondering if they run into these issues, and if it even matters to them, or And if it does, like if in some way it affects them, do you know what I mean? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Like I feel this more when I'm looking at my kid, right? Because okay, like I married a Japanese girl, so my kid is the very definition of a mixed, mixed culture, mixed breed, for lack of better words, you know. So her 23 and me is going to look a lot more interesting than mine, you know. But yeah, when I look at because I've known so little of Chinese culture, that I've kind of encouraged her to be closer to her Japanese roots. And I know it's terrible of me to not, to not emphasize the Chinese part of me more, but I know I'm so ignorant of the Chinese side of me, or of the Colombian side of me for that matter, that I would prefer that she identify more as Japanese American,
Interesting.
you know?
Is there a reason
Yeah.
for that? I mean, is there a specific reason for that? Like, what if she said, "Hey, Dad, like I know that you are Chinese, but you grew up in Colombia. Like, I want to learn more about that, and I want to get in touch more with
Yeah,
those
sometimes
roots as well." Like what do you say to her if that time comes?
well, that's the thing. She's already had those questions.
Ah,
and,
okay.
and yeah, no, it's interesting. Kids surprise you, man. And she's had those questions since she was 6. Actually, she first brought it up then,
Whoa.
and actually, it was my wife who kind of addressed it. She went, "No, your dad's American," you know.
Mm,
And sometimes, like, she throws in my face, like, "You're not Chinese, and you're not Colombian either,"
right.
But you definitely, but there's no question that I am American.
Sure.
That seems to, again, like, that's the American coming to the forefront, I guess.
Right.
Um, so she gets that, but sometimes she's wondered, Felicity, she's wondered that about herself as well too. Like, she says, "What am I?" And like, "Oh, I'm more Japanese," because she spent a lot more time in Japan. We really encourage the language learning, and then just to give you a little bit, just to catch you up on Felicity a bit. We put her into, after preschool. We ended up putting her into a dual immersion school, um, and it was dual immersion Mandarin
Whoa.
Spanish.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was us being real ambitious. But like for preschool and all that stuff, we had her going into a Japanese preschool, because it really wanted her to focus down, get that Japanese portion of it, tied down and set, right? Like, it wanted her. She needs to communicate with mom. She needs, I feel like we have a closer tie to the Japanese side of it than we do to the Chinese side of it. So I'd rather focus more on that because I feel like I'm more invited into that end, if that makes any sense. I have a very good relationship with my in-laws,
Mm-hmm.
and so even though there is a language barrier, we connect better, you know, and they like that I'm supportive of that.
I see.
I try to use as much Japanese as possible at home. My wife obviously always communicates in Japanese as well too, and it was interesting because somewhere along the line, I think when Felicity was about 3 years old, she saw that mom did not understand certain things, and she automatically code switched to sometimes even translating for mom.
Wow.
Like, right, like she knew to speak to me in English, but she knew that I also responded in Japanese. But when, certain things, like when she would look at mom, she would code switch, and like she would use, katakana pronunciation for certain English words too with mom instead of using the true
Okay.
English pronunciation, which was kind of funny. And she started doing that at 3,
Wow.
which was amazing. Kids, like, you start to see that difference in their cultural identity as young as that.
Yeah.
And that was interesting for me to witness because,
Sure.
it's like it made me wonder, was I like that? You know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that was an interesting thing to witness. But anyway, yeah, she was learning Mandarin, she was taking Japanese school, Asahi Gakuen, and on the weekends and everything. She still does it. But ultimately we decided to drop Mandarin because, some of her grades were starting, English was starting to suffer because it was just too much stuff, and we knew that if it got to that point, we'd have to pull her out, and we did,
Makes
and
sense.
and that kind of the trick. So unfortunately, I would, as much as I would have loved for her to pick up Mandarin, yeah, it just realistically it was too much to put on her plate.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I imagine it's a lot of, I mean, adapting just to the language itself. I imagine would have slowed down the process of learning other things, just because of the entire process of having to translate in your mind and interpret. And so,
Right.
wow. Okay.
And I thought,
Wow.
I mean, we could have put her into the Spanish track, and I would have been more effective at helping her.
Sure.
Mandarin, I couldn't help her at all.
Right.
The only person in our family who speaks Mandarin is my mom, and that's it. You
Wow.
know,
So your mom speaks
um,
Mandarin and Cantonese.
correct.
Okay.
Uh, Cantonese primarily, but she's it's very common for a lot of Chinese people to speak at least two dialects. You know, but yeah, I remember it's like, okay, and I remember, and Natsuko, my wife, she also asked me, why don't we put her in Spanish? You can help her, and that's true. I could help her. I'd be more effective. Um, but I went like, you know what? Globally, I feel like Mandarin would be the way to go. She's if she's getting a job and everything, and like I can live with her having high school Spanish, learning high school Spanish than high school Mandarin, because high school Mandarin doesn't work. It's ineffective. You know, high school Spanish, at least it's functional. You know, high school Mandarin, no, you can't get a job with high school Mandarin. You know, it has to come in early. So yeah, so we ended up taking that route, which ended up not working out anyway. But yeah, I don't know if
Dude,
that answers
so
your
much,
question.
man. Nah, dude, you've answered so many of my questions, man. I know we have limited time, but I just have like one or two more questions for you. By the way, thank you so much for sharing all this stuff. I'm learning so much about you today, Hugh. And even though I've met you like 10 years ago, this is crazy.
Jesus
Uh,
Christ,
yeah,
has it
dude.
been that long?
Yeah, it's been that long. But anyway, just two more questions for you, and then I know you got stuff to do, so I'll let you be. But if you could go back to your younger self and give yourself some advice or some pointers, what would you tell yourself? Like, at what point in your life would you go back, and then, like, what would you say to yourself?
I feel like it was around middle school, high school, where I had the largest, and I feel this is true out of everybody, right? This is when we have our identity crisis. We don't know who we are. We're trying to find our place, right?
Hmm.
I know, as cliche and as trite as it sounds, like I would have told them, trust yourself. Don't feel like you need to follow what everybody else is thinking. Just be you. Trust yourself, who you are. And I know, thinking of myself back then, I would have just ignored it. Even if it came from me, you
Right,
know,
right, right.
I would have just flat out ignored it and told him, man, that old guy doesn't understand me, even though he's me. you know,
That's
I,
funny.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, if there's anything that I would tell myself, I mean, yeah, it would be that, but you know, you, that stage of adolescence is such a tumultuous time that honestly, it doesn't. I don't feel like the whole Back to the Future thing doesn't work. I feel like we're in some ways we are so stupidly stubborn and so into ourselves that we would just things will just play out the same way. You know.
Don't tell me that, Hugo. Don't tell me that. I want to
Sorry,
believe. I want to believe Martin
sorry,
McFly.
sorry. I'm gonna quote, what is the Avengers and say like that's not the way time travel works.
Yeah. No. I want Biff to lose, man.
Right.
All right. Well, cool, man. And then last question for you, I guess. Given considering there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and it's not just the US. I know people want to bring it up like it's in the US, but at this point, I've, like you've had a chance to live in Japan and other places. I've had a chance to be in Japan and in China, and I've just been very fortunate. And even now, I'm living in France, and everywhere you go, there's always some sort of problem going on, right? But I feel like these days there's a little more negativity. And again, like I mentioned, part of this podcast for me is just being a little more human, and giving a chance for real people to express their stories and what they've been through, and so people can see that there's even though there's things that can go wrong, like and things can be insane, just like the story you said about your mom and all the sacrifices she made. Like, I'm trying to throw out some positivity out there, right? I want people to see that there's always hope, and that there's always another story, and that things can always look up no matter what conflicts you're having and whatever's going on. So if you had a message to give to the audience or to the world out there, like what sort of message would you like to like give out?
I mean, with all of this stuff, I mean, especially now post, second term of Trump era, I guess, and all of these mass deportations and everything. It's like, okay, well, and I don't want to be labeled as, oh, I'm for or against in any way, shape, or form of it. I believe there's always another story. There's always something else. It's like some people do deserve to get deported back. Some people should not be here. And then there's other people that, do deserve a second chance. Um, there's always a much larger story to everybody. Everybody has a larger story. Everybody. I mean, we might think we go day by day thinking, I'm just a regular guy. There's really nothing special about me. That's not true. It goes beyond that. For most people here in the U.S., we carry a much larger story than just what's limited to us.
Mm-hmm.
It goes down the line. You know, and I guess that's one thing when you find yourself in a difficult situation and you feel like you're kind of falling into labeling others. Remember that they're not just a face. There's a lot more. There, like you said, everybody's a story. They are a story,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't just automatically label somebody in that way. And then, just what's the word I'm looking for? Minimalizing. God, I can't think of my words right now. But yeah, you can't diminish them in that way.
Right.
Yeah, that would just be my only thing. It's like, hey, keep in mind that you're dealing with a person, and you
Sure.
don't know where they came from.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, man. With that, I'm going to free you up, but dude, this has been such a good conversation. I think it was. I don't know that we've ever had this conversation, at least this deep. So I very much
We're
appreciate you.
working,
Like, our conversations are always limited to like old grandma style flattery
right?
and joking, right? But dude, thank you so much for sharing so much of your background. I learned a lot of things about you today, and again, it's stories like yours that I want to expose. It's people like you that I feel have, you know, a background that's not always expected, or something that's not, like people think people are just, like you said, one thing, and there's so much behind that. And I'm sincerely grateful for you taking the opportunity to do this. And maybe next time we can do this in Spanish, what I feel would be very interesting, because I would love
Ay,
to
Dios
expose this.
mío.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I think it would benefit, even though you can put translations and all that. I think it would also be interesting to have it and expose this to like a Spanish speaking audience, because I want to make this a bilingual podcast, not just and if I can even do it in French, I'll even try in that. But I'd love to sort of build a larger community of people that can share ideas, that we can all relate to, and and build some connection and humanity between the rest of us. So thank you, Hugo, so much for your time. I'm very grateful, and I appreciate your time, brother.
Hey, man. Yeah, thank you. Wow, I haven't thought about this stuff in a long, long time. So thank you for bringing it up.